Arizona Territory, 1883. The sun was falling fast behind the red cliffs of Oak Creek Canyon, and Willow Oakes was running out of time her horse had thrown her not long after noon, spooked by a rattlesnake, its hiss like a match to powder. She hit the ground hard, shoulder first, and by the time she sat up, the mare was already gone, hooves pounding a path deeper into the canyon. She screamed for help until her throat burned raw. No one answered. Now, dusk was slipping in like water through cracks. Shadows stretched long over the canyon floor, and the cold crept down her spine. Willow had come west from Missouri just 2 months before, hoping to start over. Her brother had said the air out here might help her lungs, and she'd believed him, wanted to believe that wide skies and dry heat could cure old grief. She'd taken a teaching post in Sedona, letters of recommendation pressed between pages in her Bible, and convinced herself she wasn't still mourning a man who never truly loved her. Now, she was alone in a canyon with no voice, no horse, and no map. And it was getting dark. She stumbled forward, her boots slipping on loose shale. "Help," she rasped, but the sound barely reached beyond her lips. Her throat was too dry. She dropped to a knee beside a scraggly piñon pine, forcing herself to breathe slow. The canyon walls pressed in tight here, orange and gold stone rising on both sides like teeth. One wrong step and she could fall into a gully, or worse. She pressed a hand to her ribs. They ached deep from the fall. Her dress was torn at the hem, streaked with dust, her bonnet long lost. She looked up at the sky. The sun was almost gone. She was going to have to spend the night out here, alone. She wrapped her arms around herself and sat down hard on a flat rock, trying not to cry. Her voice was useless now anyway, a sound. She tensed. Hoofbeats. They echoed off the canyon walls, slow but steady. She stood, swaying a little, her lips cracked when she tried to call out. Nothing came. Over the ridge to her right, a man on horseback appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn dust coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. The horse beneath him was a deep chestnut, strong and sure-footed. He saw her and reined in fast, boots hitting the ground before the dust even settled. "Ma'am," he said, moving toward her. His voice was steady, low, but there was worry in it. "You all right?" she tried to answer, but her voice broke in pieces. "Horse, gone," she whispered. "Lost." He caught her before she fell. "I've got you," he said, his arms strong around her back, guiding her down slow. "Easy now." Her eyes blinked up at him, wide and dazed. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and tipped it to her lips. "Just a little," he said. The first sip burned, but she drank anyway. When she looked at him again, he was crouched beside her, watching close. "I'm Ford Fallon," he said. "Came up the canyon looking for strays." "Saw your tracks, figured something was wrong." She nodded, barely. "Willow," she croaked. "Willow Oakes." He gave a short nod. "You hurt?" Shoulder, ribs, voice. "You're lucky I found you before night fell," he said, and she saw the relief in his eyes. She tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. He looked back at his horse. "We need to get you out of here. You think you can ride?" She hesitated, then nodded. He helped her up slow, careful of her side, and lifted her onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. She flinched when his hand brushed her waist, but he was gentle, his grip steady. They rode in silence for a while, the canyon walls closing in, then opening wide as they climbed. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky turning lavender. She leaned back against him, too tired to hold herself upright. His arm came around her middle, warm and solid. "You from Sedona?" he asked. She nodded. "I've got a cabin not far past the North Ridge, just a mile or two. We'll get you there, get you warm." She wanted to thank him, but her voice was gone again. So she just closed her eyes against his chest and let herself breathe. When they reached the cabin, twilight had fully settled. It was small, tucked against a hillside, with smoke curling from the chimney. He lifted her down and carried her inside. He laid her gently on a cot near the fire. The place smelled like pine and coffee and dry wood. He brought a blanket, tucked it around her, then crouched to stoke the fire higher. "You're safe now, Willow," he said, glancing back at her. She met his gaze. His face was rough from the sun, jaw strong, eyes the color of canyon stone. There was something in them, something steady and kind. "You should sleep," he said softly. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on him, and his stayed on her. Later, when the fire had burned low and the moonlight touched the windows, she stirred and found him sitting in a chair beside her bed, arms crossed, head tilted forward. "Ford," she whispered, voice barely there. He looked up fast. "You all right?" She nodded. "Thank you." He came to sit beside her again, voice quiet. "You scared me, finding you out there like that." She reached for his hand before she could think better of it. He did not pull away. Their fingers stayed twined, warm in the flickering light. And for the first time in weeks, Willow felt something like safety settle in her chest. Not just because she was no longer alone, but because of the way he looked at her. Like he was already falling, too. When Willow woke, the fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was wrapped in a hush so still it felt like the earth itself was holding a breath. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, but the blanket tucked around her kept the worst of the chill out. She pushed herself upright slowly, the motion stiff and careful. Ford was gone from the chair beside her, but the door stood ajar, letting in a faint gray light. Morning. Pale and early. A low clang came from outside metal on stone. She stood, bracing against the wall as her body protested. Every step was measured, but she made it to the doorway and leaned against the frame. Ford was crouched beside a flat rock, sharpening a blade with calm precision. A battered coffee pot rested on a tripod over a small outdoor fire. His coat was off now, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms marked with old scars and sun-browned skin. "You're up," he said, not looking over. "I didn't mean to sleep so long," she said, her voice still rough but clearer than before. "You needed it." She stepped out slowly, easing herself down onto a low stump a few feet from him. He handed her a tin cup without asking. The coffee inside was strong and bitter, but the heat of it was grounding. She looked around. The land behind the cabin opened into a narrow draw scattered with juniper and scrub oak, the red earth still damp from last week's rain. A few chickens scratched at the ground near a fenced patch of soil where green shoots broke through. "You live here alone?" she asked. He nodded once. "Since spring. Before that, worked cattle down south of Prescott, drifted some." She traced the rim of the tin cup with her thumb. "You don't strike me as the drifting kind." He set the blade aside, wiped his hands on a cloth. "Didn't used to be, things shift." She didn't press. There was a weight in his voice that didn't ask for questions. "You're not from Arizona," he said, glancing over. "No," he waited. "I taught school in Missouri," she said, "until I couldn't anymore." His gaze didn't flinch, but he didn't ask why. She was grateful for that. "I have a room in Sedona," she added. "Above the Mercantile. I was visiting one of the ranches north of town when I got turned around. I'll take you back when you're ready." She nodded. The thought of riding still made her ribs tighten, but she didn't say so. "I can walk," she said instead. His brow lifted just slightly. "You made it through one night, let's not rush the second." She glanced down at her skirt. Dust streaked the fabric and a tear along the lower hem had widened. Her gloves were gone. Her hair hung loose at her neck, the pins long shaken free. "Can I help with anything?" she asked. "You can rest." "I've done plenty of that." He stood, nodded toward the lean-to beside the cabin. "There's a basin in there. Water's clean. I'll see to breakfast." She found the wash basin and a small rag folded beside it. The water was cold, but it cleared the dust from her face and eased a little of the tightness behind her eyes. She wound her hair into a loose coil and secured it with a strip of torn muslin she found in a basket of kindling. When she stepped back out, the sun had climbed higher and the canyon rim caught the light like fire. Ford had laid out a tin plate with cornbread and beans. A slice of late-season apple sat beside it. "You didn't have to go to trouble," she said, easing down. "It wasn't." They ate without much talk, just the sound of birds chattering in the scrub and the wind slipping through the canyon mouth. When she finished, she set the plate aside. "You said you worked cattle," she said. "Was that always your trade?" He nodded. My father ran a spread near Abilene, thought I'd take it over one day, then cholera came through, took my mother. She didn't speak, just watched the way his fingers folded around his cup. After that, I left Texas. Didn't know where to land for a long time. And now here. He looked toward the east where the land dropped into the valley below. Something about this place, it's quiet, holds its own. She followed his gaze. The silence was a kind that felt chosen, not forced. I didn't think I'd end up here either, she said. I thought I'd be married by now, home of my own, children. He didn't look at her, but she felt his attention all the same. But some men, she went on, they only want a woman when she's easy to carry. Not when she's heavy with grief or too worn to pretend otherwise. His jaw shifted, slow. Then they're cowards, she looked at him. I don't say things I don't mean, he added. She believed him. The wind picked up, stirring the dry grass near the porch. One of the chickens clucked and flapped awkwardly toward the coop. She stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. I can help with the garden. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Fine, but just the onions. She smiled for the first time since waking. Deal. And they worked side by side, the sun rising higher, their shadows stretching long on the red earth. By the fourth day, Willow could lift her arm without wincing. The deeper bruises still pulsed when she moved too fast, but Ford had wrapped her ribs snug and neat, and the tincture he'd made from willow bark dulled the ache enough to let her sleep through the night. She had asked him the morning after how he knew how to do that: bind a shoulder, brew pain relief from bark, stitch a wound if need be, and he'd only said, "You ride long enough, you learn what keeps a man upright." The days passed steady. She helped him sort seed potatoes, rake the frost-hardened soil until her hands blistered, and mend a sagging fence rail behind the coop. He didn't talk much while they worked, which suited her. The silence between them was never strained. It felt like something being built. She noticed things. The way he flicked his hat brim when he was thinking, how he always counted fence posts under his breath, never out loud. He'd carved initials into the handle of his axe, 3 letters she didn't recognize, and once before dawn, she caught him standing alone at the edge of the ridge, staring east like he was waiting for someone who never came. That afternoon, she found him oiling a bridle in the shade, the leather stretched across his knee. "I was thinking," she said, pausing at the doorway, "about going back tomorrow." His hands stilled. "You feel up to riding? I'll manage." He eased the cloth down, set the bridle aside. "I can take you before sunup. It'll be cooler then," she nodded. "Thank you." He stood, brushing his palms clean on his trousers. "You'll want your things." "I didn't bring much, just what I had in my saddlebag." "I found it," he said, "a few miles downriver. Tied it behind the cabin." She hadn't thought about the saddlebag since the fall. The books inside were likely ruined. Her brother's letter, creased and worn from being read too many times, had been tucked in the side pocket. She looked up at him. "I appreciate you going back." He shrugged, but there was something careful in the way he looked at her, like the words she chose mattered more than she knew. "I'll heat water," he said. "Wash up before supper." She watched him turn toward the shed, the sun catching at the back of his neck, and didn't follow. Instead, she walked to the fence line behind the coop. A hawk circled overhead, slow and wide. The air smelled of sage and evening. She closed her eyes. She wasn't ready to go. The thought came quiet, but it rooted deep. She had told herself this was just a pause, a recovery. That once she could breathe without flinching, she'd return to her little rented room and resume the life she was building. But the longer she stayed, the more that life felt like something already behind her. She heard his boots crunch the dry ground behind her, but she didn't turn. "I fixed the strap on your bag," he said, voice low. The clasp was cracked. She turned then and found him closer than she'd expected. "I'm not sure I should go back yet," she said, watching his face. He didn't move. "Why not?" She didn't answer right away. A breeze lifted the edge of her sleeve. "I thought I was past certain things," she said, "but being out here, it's different." Quieter inside, he studied her for a long breath. "You don't owe me reasons." "I know," she looked away, "but I think I want you to have them anyway." He reached up then, slow, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered a moment longer than it had to. "You're welcome here as long as you want," he said. That night, they didn't speak much over supper. She'd found a jar of blackberry preserves in his cupboard and spread it over the last of the dry biscuits. He didn't comment, just passed her the butter when she reached for it. Later, as she folded the wool blanket near the fire, she said, "Did you ever think about settling before now?" He glanced up from the blade he was stropping. "Used to, thought I would." "What changed?" He looked at her across the room, and something in his face eased. Nothing fit. "Until now," she didn't answer. Just smoothed the edge of the blanket again and let the quiet settle. When she turned toward her cot, he stood and crossed the room. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak. Just waited. She stepped closer. Her hand found his first. And when he leaned in, slow as dawn, and kissed her firm and sure, and without question, she felt something shift inside her that hadn't moved in years. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. "I won't ask you to stay," he said, "but I'll be here if you do." She closed her eyes. "I already have." The next morning broke slow and windless. A thin veil of cloud softened the sunlight, casting the canyon in a pale hush. Willow stood at the edge of the garden, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, watching as the chickens picked their way through the frost-stiff grass. Ford was inside, splitting kindling near the hearth. She could hear the steady rhythm of the hatchet, clean and sure, like a heartbeat beneath the quiet. She hadn't spoken much since the night before. Not out of hesitation, there wasn't any of that left, but because the feeling sitting in her chest was too wide for words. A certainty had settled in her, one that didn't need explaining. She hadn't thought she would find something like this out here, a life that asked nothing from her but truth. Ford stepped out carrying a small wooden box. His sleeves were rolled again, but today he wore a light wool vest, buttons dulled with age. He set the box on the porch rail. "I made something," he said, lifting the lid. She stepped closer. Inside, nestled in a fold of flannel, was a small hand plane, its blade honed, the handle worn smooth. "It's not much," he said, "but it fits the hand well. Thought you might use it if you stay." She ran her fingers along the edge. "What would I be planing?" He glanced toward the shed. "I've got some pine boards. Thought we might build bookshelves. That is, if you've got books worth keeping." "I have 6, she said. "Only 3 are whole." "Well, that's 3 more than I've got. I figured they might want a home." She smiled, slow and quiet. "They would." They sat on the porch after that, the box between them. She asked him about the iron branding tool hanging beside the door, the one shaped like a double crescent. He told her it had belonged to a friend who died up near Flagstaff, and that he kept it with him because the man hadn't had family to carry his name. "I've lost people too," she said. "Not to illness, just choices." He didn't press. Instead, he reached over and rested a hand against the side of her leg, just above the knee, grounding her without a word. Later, they walked the ridge trail above the draw, past where the first of the wild sunflowers had started to bloom. She picked one and held it between her fingers as they walked. "I taught a boy once," she said, "who used to draw these in all the margins of his writing, wouldn't write a single sentence unless he could start with one." Ford looked down at her hand. Maybe he saw something good in them. He said they looked like the sun, that if he could put one on the page, maybe it'd feel warmer. They stopped beside an outcrop of lichen-covered stone, and she sat, stretching her legs out in front of her. The air was cooler here, the wind steady but not sharp. Ford sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. "I didn't think I'd find anyone like you," she said after a while. He didn't answer at first, just watched the valley below. "When I first saw you in that canyon," he said finally, "I wasn't sure if you were real. The way you looked in that light, I thought maybe I'd imagined you. You didn't." He turned to her. "I know now." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he shifted to let her rest there fully. They stayed like that until the wind picked up, brushing the grass flat in waves. When they returned to the cabin, she knelt beside the hearth and stirred the coals back to life. He lit the lantern while she laid the tin kettle over the flame. She reached for the bread tin and found a folded cloth beneath it. Unwrapping it, she found a carved length of wood, a slender hair comb, smoothed and finished, the teeth even and clean. "I started it before I knew if you'd stay," he said. "Didn't want to hope too loud." She turned it over in her hands, tracing the notches he'd etched along the edge. They formed a pattern simple, repeating a rhythm that grounded her more than she could say. "I'll keep it," she said. He nodded once, then came to kneel beside her. "I'd like to build more than shelves," he said. She met his eyes. "So would I." The fire caught then, flames rising slow through the kindling. Outside, dusk settled over the draw, quiet and full. And inside, wrapped in the soft hush of pine smoke and lamplight, they stayed close, building something steady from the silence. When the first freeze of November settled over the canyon, Ford rode out to barter hay for the mule and a half sack of flour from a neighbor downriver. Willow stayed behind, whittling slats for the bookshelf they'd begun assembling near the hearth. Her shoulder no longer ached when she lifted her arms, though she still caught herself favoring it by habit. The air inside the cabin smelled of dried sage and spruce pitch, and the small window near the cot let in a spill of amber light. He returned before dusk, boots crusted with frost and cheeks wind-burned. She met him at the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped in her shawl, and took the flour sack from his saddle without a word. "There's a man down at the crossing," he said, brushing snow from his hat as they stepped inside, "wants to sell off a team. Says he's headed east before the pass is close." She unwrapped her scarf with a slow nod. "What kind of team?" "Bay geldings, broad-chested, look steady." She folded the scarf over the peg by the door. "You thinking of buying them?" He poured water into the kettle. "I might if I build out the north field, could plow it come spring." She stirred the fire and set a pot of beans to warm. "We'd need more seed." His eyes lifted. She met his gaze. "You didn't think I was planning to ride back to Sedona before the snow, did you?" He didn't answer. Just crossed the room and took her hand, pressing her fingers to his chest. "I don't want a life that forgets you," he said. "You won't have to." They didn't speak again until the beans had finished. She broke a biscuit in half and passed him the larger piece. He grinned as he took it, and she noticed for the first time the line that curved beside his mouth when he looked at her like that. That night, she brought the cot mattress to the hearth, and he laid another blanket over the floor. They didn't rush. When he kissed her, it was with the kind of warmth that asked permission and gave it in the same breath. She touched the scar beneath his collarbone, and he traced the edge of her jaw like it was something worth remembering. Winter settled hard that year. Snow fell thick before Christmas, and the trail out of the canyon iced over by the end of December. They filled the days with small work, tanning hides, shaping drawer handles, boiling soap from lye and fat. At night, she read aloud from her salvaged books while he carved spoons or sanded drawer joints smooth. When the ink ran low, she taught herself to write with a sharpened twig and ash water. One morning in late January, Ford returned from the woods carrying a young spruce sapling, roots intact. He set it beside the cabin door and said nothing. She stepped out, tucking her shawl tight, and touched the frost-laced needles. "What's it for?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes steady. "A beginning, if you'll have one with me." She didn't hesitate. "Yes." They planted the tree together the next afternoon, sinking it deep in the thawed patch beside the porch. She pressed her palm to the soil when they finished, fingers dark with earth by March. The snow had thinned enough to fetch seed from the southern trail. They traded a cured hide for barley and a bag of dried beans. He built a second stall beside the lean-to, and she stitched curtains from old flour sacks, sewing by lamplight, her knees tucked beneath the table he'd built for her by hand. In early April, he carved a ring from a piece of ironwood. He set it in her palm without ceremony, his hand rough with work. "I've got no preacher," he said, "and no papers worth ink, but I'll stand beside you every day the sun comes up, if you'll let me." She slid the ring onto her finger and kissed his knuckles one by one. "You already do." They said their vows beneath the cottonwood grove that bloomed behind the ridge, just the two of them, with the wind for witness and a hawk circling overhead. She wore her mother's brooch pinned to her bodice. He wore his father's knife tucked at his belt. That summer, the shelves filled with books sent by her brother from Missouri. They wrote letters back, folded in oilcloth and carried by freight wagon once a month. He sent a copper kettle. She sent a photograph of the cabin, the spruce now waist-high. By the following spring, she was rounding soft at the middle. He kissed the curve of her belly each night before sleep, and she traced the lines of his wrist where the sun had darkened him deep. They built a crib from pine and lined it with wool. She sang while she worked, quiet and off-key. But he never asked her to stop. When the child came a girl, with her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, Ford wrapped her in flannel and held her in the crook of his arm like he'd been born to it. He handed her to Willow without a word, but his hands trembled. Years passed, but the days never lost their shape. Each season brought new work: fence mending, calf branding, jam canning, wood chopping. They kept a garden, a milk cow, a dog with one ear, and a set of wind chimes made from old spoons that clinked like laughter when the wind blew south. Some nights, they'd sit on the porch after dark, their daughter asleep inside, and watch the stars rise over the canyon rim. He'd rest his hand on her knee and she'd lean into him, the silence between them full of all the words they no longer needed. Ford never left the canyon again. He said everything he needed was right there, in the shape of her laughter and the feel of her hand in his. And Willow never once looked back. They lived long and they lived well, and they were never alone again.